Good morning, everybody. We're very pleased to see so many of you are here promptly for what is going to be a pretty busy and packed session. So although some people are already still joining, I'm going to crack on and do the normal housekeeping bits first, and hopefully everyone will be settled with coffee by the time we get into the meat of today. So the housekeeping as normal, as those of you who are regular to our sessions will remember, you are all on mute. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, which should be on the right hand of your screens to ask questions. We have, as I said, we've got a lot to get through. We can't guarantee we're going to have time at the end to answer them, but if you pop them in the Q&As, we'll get back to you separately with your answers. Also, as usual, we're recording the session, so you can just sit back with your coffee and enjoy it. You'll get sent a copy of the recording after the event. But you will need to put your coffees down just occasionally because, as ever, we've got a few polls within our session today just to entertain you and get your views. We find it really useful. Please do answer them. Nobody will know what any other person has said. It's just to get the consensus of opinion. So today you've got four of us presenting on this mixed bag. Most of you quite likely know me already. I'm Emma Radmore and I'm the legal director and practice development lawyer in the financial services and financial institutions team. And my two colleagues from that team, Lucy, who I'm sure all of you probably already know, and Duncan, who most of you already know. And we're very pleased today that we're joined by Paul, who's a managing associate in our tech team. And what we're going to be talking about is I'm going to kick off with the briefest overview, really, of the Financial Services and Markets Bill, just looking at all the changes that it's looking to bring in and when it's hoping to do it. And then I'm going to hand over to Paul, who will talk about one of those very initiatives in respect of operational resilience and the proposals to designate critical third parties and have direct regulatory oversight of them. Then we obviously couldn't let a FinLive go without an update on the consumer duty. So Lucy's going to pack as much as she can into about 10 minutes on the latest, where we are, what you are hopefully doing now. And then equally, we couldn't let this FinLive go without an update on the new requirements for appointed reps, which will be coming in before our next FinLive. And Duncan's going to finish off just running through all the things that hopefully those of you with appointed reps are already working on. So I said we'll have a poll. Before we start, very interested in knowing what is currently keeping you busy. And if it's all of them, you can select all of them. Is it the consumer duty, the appointed reps changes, operational risk, financial crime prevention, keeping up to date with changes generally? Please do tick in the box any or all that are keeping you busy, and we'll see what you think. Lovely. So thank you very much. Yeah, unsurprisingly, it will be obviously music to Lucy's ears that most of you are engaged in the consumer duty. Music to all our ears that you're actually engaged in everything that we're going to talk about. So thank you very much. Thank you also obviously for taking the time to join us today, because we know how busy you all are. So without further ado, the bill. What has happened? Well, it was rushed into Parliament just before the summer recess, and the government has been threatening to publish it for a long time, and there are a number of drivers behind this bill. The main one potentially, or as everybody has positioned it, is to implement how the future regulatory framework is going to look post-Brexit and put in place the mechanics for changing our laws. There's the competition aims, as it were, the keeping of the UK's position as a key open global financial hub and maintaining the competitiveness of the UK's financial markets. There is also the usual objective of harnessing innovation, the use of innovative technologies where they've been used some places in the markets, using them other places, and then providing the overall support for the Levelling Up initiative and, as ever, for financial inclusion and consumer protection, as exemplified not in the bill but in many other things, not least in the Consumer Duty introduction. In terms of the structure of the bill, as is always the case, and as FSMA currently is, it's a bit of a mishmash. There's many sections. In my mind, I've kind of divided it into three pillars. I've got pillar number one, which I'm calling Getting Brexit Done, which is essentially the provisions around repealing and replacing all the laws that were onshored come Brexit, and ultimately making them fit for purpose for use in the UK financial markets and how they work for UK participants. And it provides the opportunity for changing, for clarifying, for updating those laws. So that's the Getting Brexit Done pillar. I've then sort of called pillar two newly supervised entities and businesses. And by that, I mean new regimes that aren't within the regulated activities regime, but will provide more direct supervision to certain participants. The key one of these, which Paul will talk about in a few minutes, is the critical third parties, but also there will be the direct supervision of certain financial market infrastructure providers who pre-Brexit were directly supervised by EU entities, and also the introduction of the regulation of digital settlement assets, specifically to reflect the Treasury's decision to regulate stablecoins used for payment, but designed to be more flexible than that and bring in more crypto and digital assets as required. And then the third pillar, in my view, is the access to cash pillar, the formal designation of a number of deposit takers to put in place requirements so that they must ensure ongoing access to cash. Obviously, an initiative that's been going on a long time. This is putting it in law, while also giving the Bank of England powers to ensure that the wholesale cash distribution market works as it should. So in terms of the regulators and the regulatory framework, there's a proposal for a new secondary objective for PRA and FCA to give them a greater focus on not just short, but also medium to long-term growth and international competitiveness, and a new regulatory principle for them always to have regard to achieving the net zero target. The Bank of England, meanwhile, will also get a new secondary objective, and that will be to facilitate innovation in clearing and settlement so that these FMIs start to harness all the new technologies that have been coming into other parts of the market. And as ever, the international cooperation is key to the proposals. There's also quite a lot in the bill, though, about what you might call business as usual. Things like formally introducing the financial promotions gateway, whereby firms that want to approve financial promotions for unauthorised firms will have to specifically be permitted by FCA to do so. To extend the SMCR to financial market infrastructure firms which aren't currently covered by it, to provide the regulators with stabilisation powers, again, over FMIs, particularly in this case, central counterparties, to give the regulators specific powers, both to take action for misconduct by firms that are no longer authorised for things that they did when they were authorised, and to impose conditions on approvals for changing control. Even though we're already seeing these things happening, the bill is now proposing to set it in stone. Also, just segueing to yet another regulator, the bill's proposing to legislate in the law for the payment systems regulator to be able to require mandatory reimbursement for victims of APP scams. And finally, there's, again, it's already been announced, but this is how credit unions will be allowed to engage in business on a wider product range. In terms of timing, as I said, it was first introduced on the 20th of July, had its first reading. When they came back, it had its second reading, and now it's within the Public Bill Committee where it is having its line-by-line scrutiny. We expect a report on that published by the 3rd of November, and we will probably do a one-off webinar on that once we have analysed all the changes there. So that's probably going to be quite significant changes. There always are at this stage. And once that's happened, it will have to finish its parliamentary process. It will have to go through the same process in the Lords. If there's no agreement at the end of it, there'll be what they love to call the parliamentary ping pong while they agree all the provisions. Only then can it get royal assent. Only after that can we know when it'll be implemented. But meanwhile, as we've said, and as Paul's next presentation will particularly show, the regulators aren't letting that stop them because they're already consulting on how they're going to implement certain parts of it. So that's my really quick overview of the bill. I would be interested in another little poll about what do you think? Will we actually ever have the great hoped for one coherent rule book where everybody knows where to look and how to find it? If we will we have it in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, or is it actually never going to happen? I would love to know what you think and how many of you are very cynical. Yeah, thank you very much. I love it when we've got a lovely bunch of cynics on. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lovely thought, but how are you actually ever going to achieve this? So thank you very much for that. I am now going to hand over to Paul, who's now going to take you through the critical third parties consultation and proposals.
Thanks for that, Emma, and morning, everybody. So the headline news is that operational resilience remains a key area of focus for the regulators. The regulators are nervous, and they are nervous about the extent to which firms are reliant on unregulated entities for the provision of critical services. So this nervousness is more, it's about more than just the reliance on cloud providers, but cloud providers, ICT providers are something that are a big cause of concern here for the regulators. So if you kind of keep that in mind when you listen to what I'm about to say, that'll stand you in good stead. Now, as we all know, the relationship between regulated firms and their service providers is a well-trodden path in terms of the regulatory framework and the detailed rules that are already in place. So we have SysGate, we have all of that good stuff. The regulators feel that that isn't enough, particularly because the existing framework in the regulator's view doesn't properly address the systemic risk of failure of one entity that provides services to multiple firms. So there's not many cloud providers, for example, and the cloud providers that are active in the market are providing their services to many different firms at the same time. Hence the nervousness, and hence the problem that the regulators are trying to address here. As Emma has said, there are powers, there is content in the bill about this, but the regulators are cracking on already, and a Treasury policy statement was put out in June, and a really rather detailed joint regulatory discussion paper was put out just a month later in July. So this is clearly getting a lot of detailed thought already. Who is it who, under the new proposal, who is it who's going to designate the suppliers who are critical third parties? Well, it's going to be the Treasury who holds that power and who makes that decision. The Treasury is going into this, and the other regulators are going into this in the expectation that it's only going to be a very small percentage of providers who are going to be designated. As I've said before, ICT framework providers, cloud providers are sort of front and center in the regulator's mind, but it's a bit wider than that. It'll be interesting to see whether in time the percentage of providers is as small as the regulators are currently envisaging, but we'll have to wait and see on that. How's the Treasury going to decide who's critical and who isn't? Well, they're going to have two assessments. One is the materiality assessment, which sort of does what it says on the tin. The Treasury is going to look at the services that are being provided, and they're going to say, look, how material are these services to the regulated firm's delivery of essential activities? That kind of materiality test is something that I think we're all familiar with to a certain extent. We're going to have this new assessment as well, which is being called the concentration assessment. What this entails is the regulator looking at the unregulated firm who is providing the services, possibly immaterial services, if you like, and say, well, wow, there's a real concentration risk here, because although if you look at it from the perspective of individual regulated firms, these services aren't looking particularly material. When you look at what this provider is doing across the piece, they're doing these relatively immaterial things for so many different firms that if something was to go wrong in this space, it would cause a real problem, and therefore they need to be designated as critical. How the regulator is going to actually give effect to the designation is they're going to do that through secondary legislation. So what will it mean to be a critical third party? Well, it's not going to be very pleasant from the point of view of the third party concerned, because the proposed regulatory powers are things that regulated firms are going to be pretty familiar with. But they're the type of things that I think are going to start pulses racing at sort of AWS headquarters or Google Cloud, because you can see there on the slide, information requests ranging all the way up to powers to appoint investigators. This idea of being able to enter premises under warrant sounds and is pretty scary. This idea that as well as enforcement, the regulator is going to be potentially out publicizing failings. And ultimately, the regulator is proposing to have the power to ban particular providers from providing services to regulated firms. So that is a particularly big stick to whack people with amongst a bundle of sticks, basically. Now, the joint discussion paper is quite interesting because, as well as going into a lot of detail, I think the tone is a little bit more conciliatory. So it in the joint discussion paper, the regulators say, look, all those powers sound pretty scary. Ultimately, these powers are here to complement what's already in place, not to replace it or massively supplement it. These powers are going to be applied proportionately. There's talk in the discussion paper about over time minimum resilience standards being developed, and ultimately I think what that's driving at is it's saying to the industry, look, if these minimum standards develop and we're comfortable with them, and you attest to us or to your customer that you're complying with these minimum resilience standards, in reality, those powers, all of that regulatory scrutiny that will be there, is in practice unlikely to be something that you're subject to, as long as you're playing by the rules of the game by adhering to the minimum standards that are set. So I think the discussion paper it's interesting in tone and in detail. And there's comments. There's a while for folks who are interested in that discussion paper to provide comments. Got until December. The regulator thinks there's going to be a number of advantages to this new framework. The first is look, it's consistent with the existing operational resilience framework. So what the regulator is essentially saying is, the reality is that most, if not all, third parties who are going to be deemed critical, the reality is this level of regulation is not going to be completely new to them, because they're going to already, because of the nature of their service, whether they're forming part of a material outsourcing arrangement or something else, they're going to be familiar with what it means to provide services to heavily regulated financial institutions. So they're going to be already familiar with scenario testing. They're going to be familiar with the emphasis on business continuity. They're going to be familiar with the importance of exit planning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's more of the same, and the more is consistent in terms of its detail and its purpose. The regulators are focusing on the services that are being provided to just financial services firms. So they're not looking at the business model or the service provision of these organizations more generally. They're just interested in the services that are being provided to regulated firms. And they're pretty agnostic as to where those services are provided from. So they're not looking at location. They're not looking at the jurisdictions within which these critical third parties are operating. They're not getting down to the level of detail of, well, where's your data center? Are we comfortable with the framework in that geographical location? They're just focusing on the service provision. So that, in the regulator's mind, is a key advantage, both for them and for the people who are going to be subject to this. And the regulator's pretty confident that this is going to improve market discipline, and I'm sure it will. In terms of next steps, as Emma has said, in terms of the content in the bill, the bill's working its way through the parliamentary process. In terms of the joint discussion paper, got until December to opine on that if you're interested. I'm sure ICT providers are going to have quite a bit to say about it. So it'll be interesting to see exactly what they do say and what their tone of their input is. The regulators have already said, look, after this discussion process, we're going to have another consultation paper where we flesh out some of the detail and give people another chance to have input, which is all good. Now, that might suggest that this is something that's way off in the distance somewhere. The reality is, I think it isn't. There's a lot of detail in the discussion paper. There's the policy statement from the Treasury. It's clear that the regulators are concerned about this, and it's also clear that they've very quickly given a lot of focus and have done a lot of detailed thought on this, because there's the detail in the discussion paper is there. So critical third party folks who are likely to be designated as critical third parties should have a good feel for who they are, and they should certainly be planning as to how they're going to respond to this when it comes into force. And financial services firms who are using suppliers who are likely to be designated critical third parties, and I would say most, if not all, financial services firms are going to be, to a greater or lesser extent. You've just got to start considering this as part of the overall operational resilience work that you're doing. It's just another tier internally for you to be applying when you're looking at all of this stuff. And in terms of your external, your contractual arrangements with these types of third parties, you've got to start to be mindful of what's coming down the track and thinking about, right, well, if that does get implemented as it looks like it's going to be, what do I need? What contractual levers do I need in my contracts with X, Y, and Z that I can pull in order to satisfy the regulator that I'm dealing with this, and I've got a sufficient handle on it. So I'll just now hand over to Lucy, who I think should have have control of the slides now. Lucy?
Not currently. Yeah, I've got it now. Thank you.
Brilliant. Sorry about that.
Don't worry.
It's introducing an element of unnecessary tension. I apologise.
That's all right. Keep us on our toes. Thanks, Paul. So yeah, hi everyone. I'm going to talk for the next 10 minutes or so on everyone's favourite topic at the moment, at least it's mine, consumer duty. So I think by now we all know what the duty is and what it's intended to achieve. So this morning I want to focus on implementation planning, and it'll be quite a challenge to fit it into 10 minutes, but we'll see how we go. we've already seen this morning that this is keeping you all incredibly busy, which is great. But I'm interested to know how you're getting on with your preparations, particularly for the end of October deadline. So I have another poll for you. How prepared do you feel for the deadline? Do you not feel prepared at all? Have you started, but you're unsure as to whether you'll finish in time? Do you think you're making good progress, or are you confident that you will meet that deadline? So results are in. We've got quite a good mixture, but it seems like the majority of you have started and are making good progress, which is great. And hopefully the next few minutes will be useful for your preparations. I want to start with a few important high-level messages that we should all keep in mind. The first is that it's clear that there isn't and cannot be a one-size-fits-all approach to implementation, nor an absolutely standard implementation plan. And how the duty applies at all will obviously depend on the business of the firm and how it's structured, and how compliance will be assessed is rooted in principles of reasonableness and proportionality. FCA is clear also that its expectations need to apply flexibly and dynamically as the businesses of firms and the drivers of harm evolve over time. And another key message is that it's really fundamental that firms hardwire into all relevant areas of the business the understanding of the requirement to deliver good outcomes for retail customers, and that this is about more than TCF and communicating clearly with customers. So what should firms do first? Well, clearly someone has to be in charge of the implementation plan, but its development and delivery can't fall to one person or business unit alone. I mean, obviously that would be a huge amount of work. So whether the project's led by compliance, risk, legal, or a specialist regulatory change unit within the firm, the ultimate responsibility has to sit with the exec. So a senior manager or senior managers should be given specific responsibility for ensuring its delivery. Once this responsibility has been allocated, the board should consider and appoint a project team comprising the senior managers of each relevant business unit. And it's critical that these units don't operate in silos and that each unit understands the role and the impact of the others towards the goal of meeting the duty. It's also key to remember that the focus is not just on immediate customer-facing units or staff, and that background units of the firm may be equally critical in ensuring that the firm delivers on the outcomes. So now that the project team is in place, let's take a look at what firms should be considering when developing their plans. And we think that the implementation process can be broken down roughly into 4 stages. So the starting point for all firms is to be able to clearly understand and articulate the business of your firm. So firms should consider, for example, what its existing and target customer base is. Are there different customer bases for different products and services? How does it deliver? Sorry, my dog's just going a bit crazy. Excuse me for 1 second. How does it develop its products and services? If it's not the product manufacturer, how does it assess and select the products it sells? What's its position in the distribution chain, and what are its relationships with other firms in the chain? Are the others in the chain regulated or unregulated? So there are lots of questions to ask yourselves in that sort of initial stage. From this point, firms will be able to drill down into more detail and consider how they can evidence compliance with the 4 outcomes at each stage of each product and service, from pre-sale activities through point of sale to post-sale activities. And the best way to approach this exercise, again, will really depend on the firm's business and its structure. But in principle, an approach that analyses all stages of the customer experience could be an appropriate starting point. For instance, when considering its products and services, a firm should be asking questions like the ones I've put on the slide there in relation to each product or service that it offers. And I'm not going to read all of these out. And of course, this isn't an exhaustive list, but just to pick a few, target market, you should be asking, who is our core target market? Are there potential customers outside of the target market? If so, who are they? You know, what are the levels of financial sophistication of our core market, and which products are available to customers with characteristics of vulnerability? If you're the product manufacturer, you should be considering what your processes are around design, review, document production, and also target markets. And you should be working out who your distributors are and what your relationships are like with them. On the flip side, if you're the distributor, how have you selected the providers that you work with? Are there other distributors in the chain below you? Who are they? And are any of them your appointed representatives? Another thing to consider is, how do you keep your customers up to date? You know, how are, for example, interest rates and valuations provided and explained? How easy is it to make a claim? How are renewals explained? How easy is it to switch? And also, just again on this sort of customer support side, how are customer queries and complaints dealt with? Is the customer service function easy to access? Is it easy to access for vulnerable customers? Is the complaints process clear? Stage 3 then is the gap analysis and action plan. And firms should consider for each product and service and at each stage of the customer journey, the possible harms to customers or to any particular section of the target market. They should plan for how these risks could be mitigated and what changes should be made to already embedded processes to enable firms to address and mitigate these risks in future. And I think it's at this stage where FCA really expects firms to step into their customers' shoes and consider what good outcomes actually means. When considering outcome 1 then, whilst firms already have to comply with the requirements of FCA's prod guidance, the question now is whether their internal processes are granular enough to protect against sales to customers for whom the product might not be appropriate. And to ensure that it is at all times clear what needs and objectives the product will meet, both at a fundamental level, but also in terms of meeting the price and value outcome. A further element of an assessment under this outcome, for example, might be what is an appropriate distribution strategy, such as, you know, whether complicated products should be sold only on an advised basis or by distributors with detailed market knowledge and understanding. And on the distributor side, strategies should ensure that the method of sale takes account of foreseeable risks of customer harm. For example, if distributing a packaged bank account, recognizing whether part of the package includes features that the customer isn't likely to use or that might not actually be appropriate for them. Under outcome 2, I think the key point here is that firms must remember that it's not simply about price, but it's also about value. So some firms may, for instance, offer, say, an insurance bolt-on to a product or a service for only £2 a month. But just because the product's cheap doesn't mean that it's either suitable or good value for the customer. Firms should also consider, for example, whether there are any elements of a product fee or charge that appear unjustifiably or unreasonably high compared to the benefits that that product offers, and whether any changes to the product or the assumptions behind it should be reflected in the price. Separately, distributors need to ensure that their charges represent fair value as well, and where there are different products for different groups of customers or time-limited products, firms need to look at the overall picture for the customer. Outcome 3 then, well, all firms are well used to the clear, fair and not misleading mantra that applies to all customer communications. And this principle, of course, will still apply. And firms must remember that it applies equally to verbal communications and at every stage of the product life cycle. So communications telling customers how to switch, complain, or withdraw from a product must be as clear as those promoting the product in the first place. And in its guidance, FCA has actually suggested a system of layering, engaging, relevant, simple, and well-timed. So layering is providing key information up front with cross-references or links to further detail, but ensuring that the detail is presented clearly and consistently. Engaging is making key information easy to identify, for example, using clear headings and appropriate design devices. And one particular example FCA has called out is that Q&A formats often work really well to improve customer understanding. Relevant, consider the appropriate level of detail and don't use unnecessary disclaimers. Keep it simple, present information logically, avoid technical terms and jargon wherever possible. And again, FCA has recommended that information should be presented in a way that a 9-year-old could understand. So that's the level of simplicity we're going for here. And well-timed, consider the appropriate touch points for communicating. And communications, of course, have to work for the appropriate channel. So, for instance, it's often known that customers won't read lengthy information on smartphones. At least I definitely don't. So in some cases, it might be necessary to require them to engage via another medium if it's important that they read that detailed and lengthy information. And obviously, firms must take into account the communication needs of known customers, but it should consider sort of when mass mailing, for example, whether it's clear what the communication's about, and if only some parts of it are relevant to a particular customer, making it clear what the communication contains so the customer can easily pick out which parts are relevant to them. And it's a great idea for firms to test communications before use, which I'm sure many, if not all of you, will do, which FCA agrees is a good strategy. On outcome 4 then, the key parts to remember here are that it should be at least as easy to switch, leave or change as it is to buy the product in the first place. And the quality of post-sale support should be just as good as pre-sale support. So under this outcome, firms might want to look at the use of friction points and consider whether they act to mitigate the risks of customer harm or create unreasonable barriers. So for example, marketing teams may feel that a sales journey that involves lots of clicks leads to significant dropout before purchase and therefore may want to streamline the process. But actually, it might be necessary to build this into the process so that the customer has the opportunity to ensure they understand the product sufficiently. So I suppose it's about balance, and depending on the product and the communication need, friction can be good or bad. The final stage of implementation, as we see it, is the ongoing governance and monitoring. So for each outcome, it'll be critical to gather and properly analyse appropriate MI. And I expect this might be the most difficult part of the process for many firms. But such monitoring will enable senior management to understand things that have worked and things that haven't, to analyse the root cause of any problems and to assess what could be done better and what work needs to be done to remediate any harms that have happened or that are foreseen. Boards will need to assess at least annually the results of such monitoring, the actions taken to address any risks or issues identified, and also how the firm's future business strategy is consistent with acting to deliver good outcomes for customers. And FCA will use this assessment as part of its own assessment of the firm's compliance. and expects to be provided with the assessment and the supporting MI on request. So again, evidence is key to all of this. And I think it's also worth remembering that the FCA will hold individuals responsible through the SMCR, whether they be senior managers, the board level champion, or conduct rule staff to whom the new COCON Rule 6 applies. Onto the implementation plan itself then. As I said earlier, there can't be a one-size-fits-all approach to implementation, and that goes for the plan too. There's no standard form document, and FCA hasn't given much guidance on what plans should look like in practice. But the key thing is to get your plans down on paper, highlight the main areas of your product line or business that need the most work, and set realistic timescales. As we said before, FCA acknowledges that these plans will change and evolve over time, so don't panic. I know that's easy for me to say. Get your plans blessed by senior managers and the project team before submitting it to the board for approval. And a lot of firms have been asking, you know, what level of detail FCA expects to be in these plans. And again, very helpfully, FCA hasn't commented on this per se, but it does appreciate that the bulk of implementation itself will happen beyond the end of October, and that plans will evolve. So at this stage, I would say that the plan doesn't have to be a complete line by line of who's doing what and when, but equally it has to contain enough detail to enable effective challenge and scrutiny by the board. So again, I think it's about balance here. And that's it, simple. No, I'm kidding. In all seriousness though, we do appreciate how hard this process will be for firms. I mean, there's clearly a huge amount to be done before the end of July next year. And the poll, the poll showed that many of you are well on your way with implementation planning, which is great to see. But hopefully the last few minutes have given you some additional things to think about. But if you do have any other queries, you know where we are, and please don't hesitate to get in touch. And with that, I will hand over to Duncan.
Unmute myself. Thank you very much, Lucy. So I'm going to wrap up by looking at the changes that are being introduced to the appointed representatives regime. Firstly, by way of a reminder, both the Treasury and the FCA consulted on changes to the regime, but to date only the FCA has responded. And the changes that they've suggested or are implementing are already set to present major challenges to certain firms. In short, nothing has changed in relation to the expectations as regards the requirements as they existed previously. However, there are a number of additional requirements that have been introduced at various stages within the appointed representative process and relationship between principals and their appointed representatives. Firstly, the duty to carry out due diligence on your appointed representatives has always been there, and the need for a principal firm to satisfy itself that they broadly meet both the fit and proper test, and of course that the approved persons are appropriate individuals and that they're registered with the FCA. Obviously, this also has always required principals to carry out their own assessment of those individuals before they put them forward to the regulator. The duty to register an AR with the FCA has always been there, and this has obviously been extended more recently to include insurance appointed representatives as well, that they must appear on the register before they can start activities as appointed representatives. Appointed representative agreements have always had to be in place, and they've always had to include certain specified terms. And it's also become market practice to include other sensible terms that enable principals to comply with their legal obligations, for example, on audit and termination. And there's also always been a requirement to monitor the activities of appointed representatives as the relationship develops. So in terms of the changes that are being brought in and the way in which the FCA expects to see the regime ramped up, in particular, all appointed representatives, once appointed, will need to be notified to the FCA in advance, at least 30 calendar days before the appointed representative is put in place. Effectively, anybody looking to appoint an appointed representative will be making the notification when they submit the relevant Form A to the FCA. Then there are significantly more and more specific requirements for firms to take into account when they're doing their due diligence, both when looking at appointing the AR in the first place and as part of their ongoing monitoring of the relationship. In particular, the new requirements mean that all firms will need to provide considerably more information about the overall business of the AR, and not just that which fits within the financially regulated part of the AR's business, and outside of the actual scope of the AR agreement itself. They'll need to understand fully both the ownership and management structure of their appointed representative, any risks this poses, and the impact that might have on their relationship with their appointed representative. As part of that monitoring process, the principal will need to ensure that the management information that they seek from the AR gives a greater degree of insight for the principal into both the finances and any changes to the business of the AR as that relationship goes on. From our perspective, it seems to us that for a number of firms, this will add a significant degree of additional work, particularly where the appointed representative is for a very specific purpose from the principal's perspective, and is actually a relatively small part of a much larger unregulated business. In addition, there's a new form which will need to be filled out annually by principals in order to provide the FCA with information on complaints, revenue, and remuneration, which relates specifically to each appointed representative that the principal has appointed. In order to bolster the seriousness with which the FCA is taking this, and to guard against firms appointing ARs and then not paying their business appropriate attention going forwards, the senior management at principal firms will now have to sign off annually to confirm that they consider the systems and controls that the principal has over the appointment and supervision of its appointed representatives are adequate and robust. And in order to give a nod to the FCA's concerns over hosting firms, in particular, its concerns around the fact that their size, resources, systems and controls may not be adequate to properly supervise the number of appointed representatives that they are currently playing host to. There's no requirement, or at least there's no specific requirement as yet, for those would-be hosts to seek a specific permission, but they will need to notify the FCA in advance of their plans to start hosting. Although it should be noted that they should really be doing this anyway under Principle 11. Now, moving on to the more practical effects that we expect this to have. Firstly, principal firms will need to be performing a gap analysis to check whether what they currently do when looking to both onboard an appointed representative and in terms of their ongoing monitoring of their appointed representatives ticks all the new boxes. And where they identify that some of the new requirements aren't adequately covered, they'll need to seek to make appropriate changes to these processes. One of the key new requirements is the need for principal firms to be able to confirm that the activities of their appointed representatives won't result in any undue risk of harm to consumers or to market integrity. And this will flow through into all the changes that the firms will need to make to their agreements that they have in place with their appointed representatives. Further, when conducting the gap analysis, firms will also need to check that they're getting all the information that they will now need to supply on the more bulked up appointment form for appointed representatives. And they'll need to check that their ongoing monitoring will allow them to confirm that they properly assess that ongoing fitness and properly identifies any risks that the appointed representatives they have in place might pose to the principal and to the business more widely. Part of this, in turn, is making sure that principals are told when there are key changes within the appointed representative entity or amongst its senior management. So from what we've seen so far, just drawing together the overall systems and controls that firms who appoint appointed representatives should look at. While the new requirements are significant, nevertheless, there's still a need for some proportionality. And the systems and controls changes that might need to be made should be commensurate to the size of the relevant AR and the proportion of the firm's business that this appointed representative is responsible for. Firms must have in place systems and controls that will allow them to properly identify and manage any conflicts that might arise between their business and that of each of their appointed representatives. They'll need to ensure that they have effective oversight and understand the role of the management information that they seek and are able to properly escalate any issues which arise with the business being carried out on their behalf by their appointed representatives. This, in turn, should allow firms to do everything that's listed on the second row of this slide in order to be able to identify and remediate issues that arise within any of their appointed representatives, appreciate the risks associated with having a business model based on the use of appointed representatives, and to assess the overall competence of their specific appointed representatives and the key individuals who operate that AR. So one of the key things that any firm will need to be doing in order to make sure that their appointed representative arrangements remain compliant will be to look at the agreements and arrangements they have in place. Obviously, the new requirements that are being brought in should be incorporated in any new agreements that are entered into going forwards, but firms will also be expected to take a backwards-looking approach and to take the opportunity to amend any existing agreements at the first possible opportunity. The main changes that principals will need to be thinking about when they go back to check existing agreements and look to draft new ones going forwards will be the need to bolster the information they will need their appointed representative to provide to them in order to ensure that the principal can properly supervise and have the necessary information about the appointed representative's overall business. They'll also need to ensure that the appointed representative agreement gives the principal the right to terminate in the specific circumstances listed on this slide, which I won't go through in detail, but they expand on those situations in which a principal needs to be able to terminate a relationship in order to ensure that an appointed representative isn't impacting its own, the principal's own regulatory obligations. These aren't necessarily only to do with the AR, and hopefully many of them are already covered in most agreements, but they're in they're supposed to cover situations where a principal is no longer able to properly supervise an appointed representative, as well as issues arising with the appointed representative themselves. So lastly, and quite importantly, when does all this come into effect, and at what point do principals need to be taking action? So firstly, the new rules take effect predominantly from the 8th of December this year. So from that date, any new appointed representatives put in place will need to be put in place in a framework which satisfies the new requirements. As already mentioned, any existing agreements will also need to be amended from their first renewal or revision from the 8th of December in order to ensure that they also adequately cover all the new requirements. Firms will be expected to conduct their first review and to report on their existing AR relationships by the 30th of November next year, so in 2023, and the first check against that accurate information is being provided in respect to their first accounting debt will be required in advance of their first accounting date on or after the 1st of December 2023. And as mentioned when I had the first slide up, this may not be the end of the changes that are going to be brought in to the appointed representative regime. The Treasury's review the Treasury hasn't yet responded to its own consultation, and when it comes to conduct its own review, it may well be that it introduces further legislative changes, but we're still waiting on that. So lastly, in order to wrap up, I'd just like to plug a couple of extra sessions that we have in place coming forward in future. Lucy and Emma will be giving a Lexology webinar on the consumer duty on the 11th of October. And our next FinLive, which will be a focus session, is on the 13th of December. So hopefully many of you will be able to attend those.
Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. I think we've responded to questions that we've had in the Q&A. Anything else, you know where we are, and we hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much. Goodbye.